So today we're joined by Kevin Vogler, who is a spatial wildfire analyst with Pyrologics. He earned a BS in environmental science from the State University of New York at Onatina. I might have said that wrong. And then an MS at Forest Resources from Oregon State University College of Forestry, which also is also where I earned my MS. So we go back a little bit. His past research includes work developing methods for field treatment prioritization, logging and transportation cost analysis, forest growth and yield modeling, and biomass carbon assessment. His wildfire and silvicultural modeling expertise are grounded in previous field positions, where he collected data on first order fire effects and wildfire disturbance history, and as well as working on prescribed fire assignments in 9 different states. So he has been around. I'm going to switch screen shares and let you take it away, Kevin.
All right. So let's share a screen here and make sure I get the right one. And are you seeing my screen?
That looks great. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Stacy, and thanks, folks, for joining on here. I know by this point, folks might have a little bit of Zoom fatigue, so I appreciate you signing on and listening here to some of the work we've been working on. So today, my talk is entitled, Can Landscape Field Treatments Enhance Both Protection and Resource Management Objectives? And this is a joint fire science supported project that I've been working on along with my boss, Joe Scott at Pyrologics, as well as collaborators with the U.S. Forest Service, Matt Thompson and Carol Miller. And sort of before we jump into the project here, kind of set the stage a little bit, I want to talk about fire occurrence and fire in the West. On the left here, we have a graph of fire occurrence coming from the U.S. Forest Service fire occurrence database of fires that occurred from 1992 through 2018. And we see a sort of apparent trend in this data of increasing fire. And in fact, when we look at the first half of the FOD from 1992 through 2005, and then the second from 2005 to 2018, we see about twice as much fire in the second half of that time period as in the first. And on the right here, we see a map of where those fires have burned coming from the MTBS data set from 2008 to 2017. And with more fire in the landscape, there's greater opportunity for fire to interact with stuff that we care about, with our homes. And in 2017 was a particularly sort of significant wildfire year where 24,000 homes are directly exposed from fire. And from that exposure, we saw some losses that were associated with that. In California, the Thomas Fire burned over 1,000 structures, the Nuns Fire burned over 1,300, and the Tubbs burned over 5,600 structures. And closer to me in Missoula, Montana, the Lilo Peak Fire resulted in 2 homes lost. And on the right here, we see a picture of looking south from Missoula at that Lilo Peak Fire on one of the days that it made a fairly significant run. And sort of juxtaposed with this idea of more fire in the landscape and sort of losses that's associated with that, we have to keep in mind that wildfire is a natural disturbance process. And a lot of our forests and other vegetation types rely on fire as a disturbance mechanism to maintain their structure and throughout time. And so we have here is just a simple map coming from the land fire vegetation condition class of departure from historical conditions. And a lot of this departure that we're seeing could be associated with wildfire suppression and buildup of fuels as a result of that. So to try to get at this sort of wicked problem of needing more fire on the landscape and also having all kinds of issues with fire on the landscape, the Forest Service rolled out the cohesive strategy a number of years ago with the idea of developing resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, and providing for safe and effective wildfire response. So with this project, our goal was to look at what role can field treatments play in helping implement the cohesive strategy. Specifically, how would you design field treatments to reduce the risk of loss of homes from wildfire, as well as because we would in a lot of areas we might want more fire on the landscape under the right weather conditions and under the right scenarios. How could we implement field treatments to allow for the safe and effective use of unplanned or wildland fire use of fires? So we used a simulation modeling approach to sort of game out these different strategies of how you might put fuel treatments on the landscape and look at how effective each of them are at meeting these two sort of objectives of reducing risks to homes, as well as creating greater opportunities for safe use of wildland fire use. And additionally, we wanted to look at this idea of a tipping point, or how much of the landscape do you need to treat before you start seeing impacts from fuel treatments? And is there a point at which there's diminishing returns where you don't really need to treat after that? And so before I sort of get into the bulk of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the terminology of risk. And I think this is a term that folks use a lot, and I kind of want to talk about, at least to me, how I'm using this term and what that means in this framework of this project. So risk is made up of sort of two terms, hazard and vulnerability, where hazard is the probability or likelihood of a wildfire event, as well as the intensity measured by flame length or heat per unit area, or some other measure of how that fire is burning on the landscape. And then sort of on the right here, the second term is vulnerability. You need to have something that you actually care about in the landscape to have risk. So in this project, we'll be talking about homes, and that vulnerability is sort of broken out into sort of two terms here: exposure, or where that thing that you care about is co-located on the landscape in an area that fire can interact with it. If you have your house that's in the middle of a lake, the fire can't immediately, it's not exposed to fire, but generally. And then susceptibility is if fire were to reach a given something you care about, how likely would there be of harm to that thing, or how likely? So in the speaking of how homes, what's the likelihood or the susceptibility of that home burning down or having some sort of damage? And all of that sort of gets rolled up into this term of wildfire risk. So how do we measure risk? In this project, we're using a simulation modeling approach, and we use the tool FSIM, or the Large Fire Simulation Model, to measure risk. And FSIM is sort of a conglomeration of a physics growth model, as well as a Monte Carlo simulator that stochastically simulates both wildfire occurrence and weather across the landscape. I should note that FSIM does not model into the future at all. We're not looking at climate change 30 years down the line or anything like that. What it does is it takes the next year and then stochastically pulls different weather information and puts fires down the landscape, so we can game out and what fire, how it might generally burn on the landscape. So we replay the next year 20,000 times for this project, and then allow sort of the emergent properties of fuel, weather, and topography to sort of give us information of how fire is going to likely interact on that landscape. I should also note that FSIM models a range of burning conditions. Some folks that come from operation world and are more familiar with FS Pro or WIFDIS. That tool really only models sort of the worst case scenarios. And in FSIM, we're trying to capture everything from sort of the most benign prescribed fire conditions up through sort of your really extreme sort of catastrophic weather fire events. And again, FSIM takes in information on fuels and topography, weather, as well as historical wildfire occurrence. And so for this project, we had two study areas that we looked at. The first, which I'm going to sort of be focusing in on this project, was in the Southern Sierras, as we see here on the map on the left, and the other was in north central New Mexico. And so again, we'll be focusing mainly on the Sierras here, with some sort of talk on some of the results we saw from north central New Mexico, especially because we found some really different results when we get down to some of the final modeling conclusions, and that we're still trying to tease apart sort of why we saw that, but we'll talk about that later. So in the Sierras here, I'm sure most of you are fairly, if not intimately, familiar with this landscape. There's quite a bit of federal land. I know this map, it kind of, the way that's visualized here, kind of blends out, so you miss some of the sort of nuances of inholdings and that sort of thing. But we have a diverse landscape here with a wide range of forest types and elevations from sea level up over 14,000 feet, and quite a bit of federal ownership, including Park Service, BLM, and Forest Service. And this area in the dashed line here covers about 28 million acres, where about 61% of that is in one type of federal ownership or another, or about 17 million acres. And so the first thing, one of the things we do with the FSIM simulation tool is we need to calibrate it to historical conditions, sort of confine our simulation to try to match how things would have sort of burned across the landscape historically. And what you have here is a map of our calibration targets, where we're trying to calibrate the tool both to the mean large fire size, so we're matching the size of fires that would have occurred historically, as well as a mean annual number of large fire per million acres, where we're getting the right number of fires we're putting down the landscape. And again, all of this calibration process is just to try to confine the model to match how things would have burned historically, so that when we game out these different fuel treatment scenarios, they're sort of more bounded in reality of how fire is likely to occur on this landscape. And in addition to the number of fires and the right size, we want to match the distribution of fires to how fires would have burned historically on the landscape. So we're getting the right number of large, very large, and extremely large, while also allowing for fire events in the simulation world to occur in sizes that are beyond what has occurred historically. Now, I guess I should note that we started this a few years ago, and while some of these events hadn't occurred historically, with some of the last two fire seasons, I don't think we could say that anymore. So we calibrate the FSIM model, and what do we get out of it? We get information on wildfire hazard. So again, that is our likelihood and intensity terms. So on the left here, we have a map of burn probability, or what is the annual likelihood of fire burning in any given pixel or acre across the landscape. And on the right, we have a measure of intensity, or here represented by flame length exceedance probability. And what that is the probability that of all the different fires that burned across the landscape and different weathers that could occur, and when fire burned there, what's the probability that that fire burns with flame lengths in exceedance of 6 feet for this example. But we get a bunch of different measures of intensity out of the tool. And next we have here is, like we talked about before, there needs to be something you care about in the landscape. And so for this project, we focused on houses. So here we have a map of housing unit density, or in this project we'll refer to as HUDEN. And what this came from was, it was developed by our team here at Pyrologics for a separate project, wildfirerisk.org. If folks haven't been there, a really great resource where you can put in your community and get information on the risk at your individual community. And this was a project we did at the national level, and it took information on the Microsoft building footprints, as well as census data to map where houses are across the landscape. So this gives us a map of something that we care about in the landscape, and we can use that with the intensity values to map actual risk to homes across the landscape. And with these different scenarios, we can look at, okay, how do these different potential fuels conditions with implementations of fuel treatments with different prioritization strategies and implementation levels change the risk to homes. So there are 3 different fuel treatment strategies that we looked at. We experimented with a couple other ones that we sort of left on the cutting room floor, but we're going to talk about these 3 here. And the first is focused defensible fuel breaks. And this is the fuel treatment scenario where we're trying to get at this idea of wildfire adapted communities, where we're treating immediately at where homes are, and treatments are effective at reducing flame length at those locations, so reducing the hazard to homes. The second is looking at the ability to increase the opportunities for wildland fire use, and this is getting at the idea of resilient landscapes from the cohesive strategy, and where we're treating in areas where fires are starting on federal land, leaking off of that federal land onto private ownership and exposing homes. So we're trying to implement treatment strategies to reduce that risk transmission from federal lands onto private land, which would give us a greater opportunity to safely use wildland fire use. And then our third is a random treatment strategy. And this we use as sort of a benchmark to test how well these other treatment strategies did. And that's where we just, on a random number, we put treatments on the landscape. And again, we wanted to look at this idea of a tipping point, how much you actually need to treat on the landscape before you start seeing changes in risk or opportunities. And so we implemented these treatments at 1, 2.5, 5, 7.5, 10, 25, and 100% of the treatable landscape. So when I say treatments, what does that actually mean? So we're working in the simulation of sort of framework here, and we base this on the land fire data. And what Landfire is a stack of rasters that gives you information on what the fuels look like on a given area, how tall those trees are, what's the canopy bulk density, what's the fuel model, and that sort of thing. And what we did is we universally applied a treatment everywhere, and then feed that into a sort of a prioritization model that allows us to sort of develop optimal treatments. With a few caveats. First was we did not allow for treatments on grass or sagebrush fuels, as well as this was developed for a national project, and there's some sort of noise in the data. So we removed areas that did not reduce flame length or led to a drastic increase in rate of spread. And so what these actual treatments are doing is in shrub fuels, it's in sort of land fire, FDIS speak, it's implementing a prescribed fire. And then in forested fuels, it's implementing a mechanical remove treatment. So that gives us a sort of two sort of idealized treatments from like sort of flame map speak of a treated landscape where everything is treated with some caveats, and then our current condition fuelscape that we see here in these two maps. And we feed that information into a optimization tool called the Landscape Treatment Designer. And this was developed by the Forest Service by Alan Ager and Stu Britton. And what it does is it sort of you give it information on what you want these treatments to look like, and it sort of spits out sort of an idealized fuelscape with different levels of implementation. So here on the right, we see sort of an example of that where these treatments are implemented in sort of hex cells, and they're each about, or each 90 acres is sort of our treatment unit. And then it fed into that is sort of these delta values of how well do those treatments do at reducing rate of spread, as well as reducing flame length. So let's take a look here at some maps of what these treatments actually look like. So first, we're going to look at this transmission scenario. And this is, again, where we're treating on federal land areas where fires start, leak off of federal land, and expose homes. So we're prioritizing treatments on areas that expose the most homes, as well as the ability for those treatments to reduce the rate of spread off of federal lands. So here we're seeing 1% of the landscape treated, 2.5%, 5, 7.5, 10, and then just about all of the area with 25% treatment. And next we're going to look at here is our housing unit density. And this is where we're treating where there are homes, and those treatments have the greatest ability to reduce flame length at those homes, and the likelihood of fire reaching there is the greatest. And then we're expanding those outwards away from those things that we care about. So here we have 1%, 2.5%, 5, 7.5, 10, and 25% of the landscape treated. Now, there's a fair amount of overlap between the transmission prioritization scheme and the housing unit prioritization scheme scenario. And that's what we see in the map here is when we, under that 5% treatment, the areas that are the same between those two different treatment strategies. And we see areas here around Placerville and Pollock Pines are in both scenarios, as well as around Arnold and south of Lake Tahoe. And I should note that when I'm talking about the percentage of treatment, this is across the entire landscape. So this is a fairly significant amount of area that we're talking about. So this 5% treatment overlap that we're looking at here, or well, the 5% treatment area is about 350,000 acres. And then finally, our random treatment scenario. And this is where we're just, optimizing a random number, and we're randomly putting treatments on the landscape. And it's fairly hard to see until we get up to the 25% treatment level. So what do we have so far? So we talked about, we calibrated the FSIM model. We mapped where homes are on the landscape, and we measure the risk at those homes. We developed these 3 different sets of optimal treatment strategies, where we're creating focused defensible fuel breaks immediately adjacent to homes, and as well as treating where fires start on the landscape and burn off of federal lands and exposed homes, and then this random scenario. And so we have these, and with these various levels of treatment intensity. I should note that this is fairly computationally intensive. So we have to replay these 20 different FSIM simulations that are running for 20,000 iterations. And that if we ran this on one computer, it would take about 1.5 years for those simulations to run. And I want to thank Greg Dillon at the U.S. Forest Service Fire Lab, who graciously allowed us to use some of his machines so we could get this project done in a timely manner. So we run all these different simulations through FSIM. I want to talk a little bit about what is treatment success? How are we measuring how well these treatments did? And then we'll get into some of the results that we saw coming from each of these individual treatments. So our first is looking at fire adapted communities. How well did treatments do at reducing risk to homes? And the way we measure this is using what we call like an HVRA, or highly valued resource and assets sort of framework, where we refer to this as delta ENVC, or expected net value change. And so what I mean by that is we use this formula that we see here. And what that is we sum up the likelihood, or the BP, on housing units where we know that there are homes. And then we weight that by both the intensity that we see at those given housing units, as well as the response function. And so for this project, we use a universal response function for all homes. And that's something that we sort of struggle with in sort of simulation world of how do we measure that this house is more likely to burn than this one, and knowing construction materials and that kind of thing, it's sort of beyond the scope of this project. So that summation of that term is what we call delta ENVC, and that's how we're going to measure how well these different treatments do at reducing risk to homes. And then the second is getting at this idea of resilient landscapes, or are these treatments increasing the opportunities for wildland fire use by reducing transmission of fire from federal lands onto private lands? And there, the way we're going to measure this is simply by summing up the amount of area where fires are starting that don't expose any homes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here. But first, we're going to talk about home risk and how well these treatments do. And so before we jump into that, I want to talk a little bit about exactly where the risk is, and then we'll talk about how well these treatments did at mitigating that risk. So here we have a map of the top 15 communities in the Southern Sierras for home risk. And the way we calculated this was we summed up that ENVC variable within a individual community polygon. And while these probably look a little funny, the way that these polygons were generated is folks took the census core coming from the census data, and then expanded that out with a 45-minute drive time, with the idea that some folks might not live in what's the census designated as a community, but they go into that community to get their groceries, their kids go to school there, that sort of thing. So we wanted to capture those folks as well, and that's what these polygons are showing. So in our top 5 communities that we're showing that have the highest risk in this particular landscape, Pollock Pines, Diamond Springs, Bootjack, Shingle Springs, and Rancho Calaveras come up in the top 5. And I think it was somewhat interesting that I wanted to compare this to some other risk assessments that cover this area. There was that wildfirerisk.org assessment that was a national product that I referenced earlier, as well as our team recently completed an assessment for all of California and looked at risk there as well. And there's a number of different ways that you can look at risk. You can look at average risk within a community. You can look at total risk in a community, and one might be better for prioritization versus resource allocation, that sort of thing. And what we're showing here is total risk. And I guess one of the things I wanted to note is that where the community has either an asterisk or a pound sign is where those other assessments matched up with that those were also in the top 15. And not to sort of split hairs of, this assessment's better than the other. I think this one used a different, I guess it's just interesting that some communities continuously come out at sort of at most at risk, even with different model calibration, different vintages of fuels data, different ways that we summed up the sort of risk and calculated it, that there's some places that are just continually sort of come up at high risk. So how well do our treatments do at mitigating that risk? So first we're going to look at is housing unit exposure. And what that is the likelihood of fire interacting with a home. And then later we'll talk about the damage or total risk that's associated with that. So on this graph here on the x-axis, we have increasing levels of implementation from 0% of the landscape upwards to 100% of the landscape. And on the y-axis, the number of homes that we expect to be exposed on average from wildfires. Now, I should note that we replayed these simulations 20,000 times. So some of these result in a lot more home exposures, some less, but on average, this is what we're seeing. So we see on average on this landscape about 1,600 or 1,661 homes under the current condition being exposed from wildfire. And when we treat every single pixel in the landscape, if hypothetically, if you were to do that, we could reduce that down to 269 homes exposed, or about 1,300 homes less being exposed on average per year. Now, these three different lines we have here, the red line represents that random scenario where we're just putting treatments out in the landscape randomly. This tan line represents where we're treating on federal lands that leak off federal lands and expose homes on private lands. And then this purple is where we're treating immediately adjacent to homes. And sort of not surprisingly, where we're treating next to homes gives us sort of the best bang for the buck, where treating only 2.5% of the landscape, if we're focusing those treatments right around homes, results in a reduction of 1,100 less homes being exposed per year. And there's limited benefits after about 5% treatment, which makes sense that, especially on this landscape, sort of homes are localized, where if you go out right where those homes are, you can get a fair amount of risk or exposure reduction without a lot of treating a lot of land. And next on the right, we want to look at is that first graph. We were looking at all fires that started anywhere on the landscape. And now we want to look specifically at fires that start on federal ownership, and what is the exposure from fires that start on federal lands. And here, under the current condition, we expect on average about 390 homes to be exposed from fires that start on federal lands. And that if we were to treat every single pixel in the landscape, that could be reduced down to 62, or a reduction of about 328 homes. And I think a take-home message for me here is that there are about 3 times more homes exposed from fires that start on private land than those that started on federal land. And I think this brings up sort of a talking point of scope of control, that oftentimes folks talk about wildland fire as a federal land management issue, when in reality, or at least in the simulation, we're seeing about 3 times more homes, or 3 times more homes are being exposed from fires that have absolutely nothing to do with anything that's going on federal land. Now we're going to jump into talking about housing risk. And this is where we're taking that exposure, and as well as overlaying with it information on the intensity of a fire once it reaches there, and a response function. And here we're seeing a very similar pattern that we saw in the previous slide, where housing unit density, we're treating right around homes, gives us the greatest bang for the buck in reducing overall risk. And here again, the x-axis is increasing levels of implementation, and then the y-axis is this delta E and VC value, which is, it's kind of hard to get your head around, and it's sort of a index of loss is the way I like to think about it. And again, that HUDEN is drastically outperforming where we're treating on federal lands when we look at all fires. When we look at just federal fires, that treating on federal land does a better job. But again, the federal fires only account for about, the fires that start on private land account for about 3.5 times more loss than those that start on federal land. Now, with that said, I think there could be an argument made that federal fires are intrinsically different than fires that start on private land. And by that, I mean that fires that start on private land, there's a lot more access where local resources can get at those fires, put them out and address them quicker. Where if a fire starts on federal land, it has the opportunity to get large, have a wind shift, and then burn into a community where it could where it could overwhelm suppression resources. And I think this is an area that I think we need a lot more empirical data to actually get into, where a fire starts, how many structures that are associated with that. And I think it's an area that a lot more research is needed. So a little bit more on some results here. 76% of the possible risk reduction was attained by only treating 2.5% of the landscape when we use that HUDEN, or treating right around homes scenario. And that 88% of the possible reduction was achieved by only treating 10%. And that by treating 100%, we addressed 90% of the risk. And again, I think here it's sort of interesting that, while we're never going to treat 100% of the landscape, but even if we did, there is no risk future, that there always going to be risk from wildfire on the landscape. And shifting gears here a little bit, we're going to talk about the opportunities for wildland fire use. So on the right here, we have a map of federal ownership. And then on the inset map, those black dots represent all of the large fires that were simulated during simulation. So during those replay of the 20,000 iterations of next fire season, we simulated about 600,000 large fires in this landscape. And those are fires that are greater than 100 hectares or 247 acres. And what we can do is at the individual points where we simulate these fires, the fire modeling using a physics growth model is simulating a fire perimeter out from that. We can look at how many homes are within that total in that fire perimeter, and then associated that back to the ignition point to look at where on the landscape there are locations that you can have a fire that doesn't expose any homes. And that's exactly what we have here. We used a statistical smoothing using point statistics and ArcGIS and smoothed out those points where now on the inset map, the black dots are representative of fire ignitions that didn't expose any homes, and the red dots are representative of some home exposure from the eventual fire perimeter when we associate it back to that point. And we can create here is maps with on the landscape of what are the opportunities for wildland fire use when we're looking at home exposure. And I should note that this project is just limited to home exposure, and there's lots of other resources and assets that are going to be important to land managers that are not included in this analysis. So we can look here at some maps on how well do these treatments do in increasing our opportunities for wildland fire use. So again, on the x-axis, here we have increasing level of implementation from 0% of the landscape up through 100% of the landscape. And then on the y-axis, we have the area in acres of federal ownership that allow for safe wildland fire use. And I think interesting here, we see a sort of a shift from those earlier graphs we saw on the housing unit density, where the treating on federal ownership gives us the sort of the best opportunity to allow for wildland fire use fires effectively. And I found this was a little bit surprising to me because it is the opposite of what we saw in New Mexico, where they're treating next to homes gave you sort of the best bang for the buck on sort of all treatment strategies. And I think there's a difference in the spatial distribution of where federal ownerships are versus where homes are between these two landscapes. And we're still trying to kind of figure out how to sort of best analyze those differences. But we definitely saw a different pattern here. So when we sort of pull this all together, what do we get? And so what we're going to see here is a graph of sort of those two objective variables we were looking at of increasing opportunities for wildland fire use fires and protecting homes on the same axis here, where the x-axis now is homes protected over the current condition scenario. So with these different scenarios, how much less exposure is there in these different treatment strategies? And then on the y-axis is how many more acres of federal land are available for safe wildland fire use management. And there seems, to me, it jumps out sort of a trade-off here between our purple line of the housing unit density where we're treating immediately around homes, does really well at reducing the risk to those homes, but only gives marginal increases in your ability to do wildland fire use. And I think sort of an optimal strategy is probably somewhere in the middle here of somewhere between the two. And I guess I should also note that with this, that these strategies are a snapshot in time, that with the treatments for reducing risk of exposure off of federal lands, this doesn't account for, okay, you implemented a treatment, you had an effective wildland fire use fire, you had more acres sort of treated on the landscape, sort of those compounding effects over time is not captured at all by this modeling. This is just a simple snapshot of treatments on the landscape. What does next year look like? And I know some folks have tried to get at this sort of compounding impacts over time. I know there's a tool called LSIM, the Landscape Simulation Model or something like that, that incorporates FES and allows for growth over time and so those sort of interactions. But my understanding, it's quite computationally intensive and is still fairly sort of experimental at this time. And sort of next thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of risk tolerance. So in our previous figures, when we looked at areas of opportunity for wildland fire use fires, we looked at areas where 0 homes were exposed and how much area would be available for use of wildland fire given that scenario. But what if there was a second home on the landscape that you could go out and do point protection around it first? How much area would be available for wildland fire use under that scenario? If you were willing to accept 1% or one home rather, home exposure. So what we see here is a 3D graph of sort of the decision space for land managers on area of opportunity for wildland fire use, given different tolerances of risk for the number of homes exposed, as well as a probability of its success. So on here, we see increasing levels of home exposure as you move outwards, as well as decreasing probabilities of success. And what I mean by that is when you sum up all of the ignitions in a given location, how many of those ignitions is this scenario true for? Is it 90%, 50%? How many? As well as we move down on, so I guess the z-axis here is the percent of federal lands where that condition is true. So we get this surface of opportunity for wildland fire use. So let's look at some of these results here. So earlier we were looking at 0 homes exposed with a high probability of success. And those are the previous figures, the line graphs that we looked at. And there was about 43% of federal ownership where that condition was true. Instead, if you move to 25 homes exposed with a high probability of success, you increase that to 69% of federal lands where that condition is true. And I think this is a really kind of interesting idea, where earlier we treated every single pixel on the landscape, but we weren't allowing for any homes exposed. And that led to a 2.6 million acres increase in area opportunity for wildland fire use fires. If instead we didn't treat any of the landscape at all, but we changed our sort of thinking on risk tolerance, there's a 4.5 million acre increase in area of opportunity for wildland fire use. And so what I guess talk a little bit more about what do I mean by risk tolerance. I'm not talking about, you're allowing for, homes to be lost under a wildland fire use event. What I mean here is that you have resources invested separately, where you can go out and do point protection ahead of a fire, or you've pre-invested in asset hardening with Firewise or other measures, or change local zoning regulations and building regulations, where a manager is more likely to accept some exposure where a fire might interact with the home, knowing that there likely won't be loss associated with that, or the risk of loss is a lot less. So we're going to talk about some sort of wrap-up slides here. The first is limitations. This is not an empirical study. This was a simulation modeling study, and there's all kinds of constraints and limitations that's associated with that. The first is on actual where we put treatments. We simulated treatments where they were effective without any sort of constraint on the cost of those putting treatments there. Access of, can you actually go out and manage there? Is there a road to get out there? Any of those sort of things. And I think this was sort of more of a theoretical study, and that any sort of operationalizing this would have to, of course, account for that. Additionally, the spatial resolution of home risk, we applied a universal response function to loss associated with homes, and partly because it's just very difficult from sort of a 30,000 foot view to understand which homes are most likely to experience loss. And I think that's something that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to sort of capture that. Additionally, we only looked at, for this project, of homes as the only resource or value rather that we looked at, and there's a litany of other resources and assets that land managers are going to be taking into consideration when making these decisions, including water quality, critical habitat, timber, as well as a number of other. And again, I talked a little bit about these treatments did not, the sort of the synergies between wildfire and these treatments aren't fully realized in the model. While there is a suppression algorithm in the FSIM tool that sort of puts out fire as you reduce flame lengths and allows for sort of suppression, where you might have implemented a field treatment with the idea that this is going to be a strategical location for a backburn, and you thinned off 100 yards off of a road. The tool does not allow for how you might change your management actions based on the differences in fuels. That is not fully captured in this model. And again, this idea of the potentially difference of federal and the nature of federal and private fires, and I think that's an area for more research. And so finally, to bring up some conclusions, if I can call them that. I think what we presented here is sort of a novel quantitative framework for analyzing the opportunities for wildland fire use. And I think there's lots of opportunity for how you might be able to use this sort of framework in aiding the mapping of pods or potential operation delineations. And I think it highlights, this work highlights the scope of control around federal land management, and that a lot of the risk that's associated with home loss is from fires that are not originating on federal land. And there's so much as federal land managers on federal land you could do to reduce the risk to homes. And then we found here that treating nearest homes had the greatest benefit for reducing loss to homes, which I think makes a lot of sense, that there's something you care about, treating is immediately adjacent to it, the likelihood of fire interacting with that and then having ability to reduce the risk to that is the greatest, and that there is no zero risk future. And again, this idea of risk tolerance, of how while there's utility in investing in fuel treatments and sort of traditional forest and land management, that some of these ideas around acid hardening and pre-planning potentially could have greater impacts on our ability to do wildland fire use fires. And with that, I think we have some time for questions, and turn it over to that.
Thanks so much for that, Kevin. I'm gonna make a super quick plug before we get into Q&A. So first of all, feel free to put in any questions you have right there, and we'll just go through them in the order we receive them for the most part. And I'm going to put something in the chat, which is just a very brief little evaluation survey. It should take less than 5 minutes. We are, of course, grant funded, so the more information we have about who's attending these and what's useful and what we need to do in the future really helps us plan that. So I'll put that in a second, but let's start with what I think is going to be a pretty easy question. Just what is the distance from structures that was used for treatments identified as adjacent to homes in this model?
Yeah, so we didn't set, like, there was no, you have to be within X distance. So the way that the prioritization scheme worked there is we treated at a home where it was a burnable fuel at that home, and where treatments had the greatest impact on reducing the flame lengths there. And then we smoothed that data out, that ENVC or CNVC rather, but data at that home outwards, where then you treated immediately. Your highest priority was where that home was, and then you sort of spread out from there. So I don't know exactly, and we could do some summaries of what's the average distance to home and that sort of thing, but we haven't done those calculations yet.
Great. And if there's a question, we answer it, and there's a follow-up, also feel free to type that in. I actually had a question which was about vegetation types. I know you briefly mentioned when you're using land fire data which types of vegetation you did not include, and I guess I was curious if you could go a little bit more into like what that would mean, and like the implications of this, because it really does seem like it's pretty forest centric from what you're talking about. And so many of our issues, especially in our central southern part of the state, fuel treatments are a lot more complicated and effectiveness is a lot more complicated. So just maybe a little bit about how you made those decisions or how that's going to affect implications.
Yeah, and yeah, so grasslands, we didn't allow for treatment there because we wanted to simulate treatments that had a lasting impact. And so you could go out and annually or perennially mow grass and that sort of thing. We didn't. I feel like that was sort of beyond the scope of what we were looking at here. And then excluding sagebrush, sort of the ecological justification for managing in sagebrush, I think is debatable. And part of it, we are leveraging sort of previous work with this research project. There was a national assessment where they created this treated fuelscape at the national level, and we were wanting to utilize that. So we were sort of taking their rules that they were associated with that. And there was a fair amount of folks. There was a team of folks at the Fire Lab, as well as our company that were sort of worked on that project and looked at, what are realistic sort of changes in fuel models that you might see for a given treatment. But of course, where a more localized sort of treatment, you could definitely improve upon that and pull in more site-specific information on what those treatments look like on your given fuel type and forest and that sort of thing.
Excellent. And my follow-up with that is just, did you mention too that was there any like time frame that oftentimes fuel treatments become less effective over time depending on, like, was that incorporated all into this model?
It wasn't. So with this study, we looked at just next year what that would look like, and like I mentioned earlier, there has been some folks that have looked at sort of modeling out through time, and part of it, I think it gets tricky with that is because it's so computationally intensive. You have to really reduce the number of iterations that you can actually simulate this with. So there's a lot more noise that's in there versus I feel like while I mean this was was quite computationally intensive, we can still simulate a lot of iterations on the landscape. But I think you find the actual patterns a lot more clear than I feel like you sometimes I've seen maps of large fire probability or some or risk or some things like that, and they're quite pimply, and I think it's just sort of model noise. So we did not model into the future at all. This was 20,000 iterations of what next year might look like with variable weather, variable occurrence of where fires might start, and that sort of thing.
Great. And we do have another question. Okay, so someone was curious as to why Clovis, California made the list of your most at-risk housing communities. Given that it's surrounded by Fresno, grasslands, oak woodlands, they would have thought that some of the more forest-based communities would have been a higher risk.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I'm not sure. I'm not that familiar with that area, so I don't know why that would have came out that way. I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't know, and I think that's something that's definitely, yeah, that's worthy of looking into it more, for sure. And with this assessment, I mean, there's this was very much a rough sort of assessment of risk, and there's a lot more refined and sophisticated ways that folks have done this. The wildfire risk tool, as well as our team has done a risk assessment for California state that includes all communities within California, that used a lot more finer resolution of data and some more sophisticated methods that were sort of beyond the scope of this project. Mostly with this, my interest was with this sort of rough scale is a coarser resolution of the data to simulate all the different treatments and that sort of thing that we did, and the number of simulations. Does it match at all with some of these more refined assessments? And I think generally yes, and I think there's definitely with any of these types of assessments, there's all kinds of nitpicking that can be, not that I'm saying you're doing, but you can say, well, this one should be higher, or this one should be higher. But I think that the trends generally come out fairly consistently of there's some communities that they're at a higher risk, and Pollock Pines coming up there, and which was impacted by the Caldor fire just a few weeks, if not a month or two ago, comes out on there. And we were looking at some of this earlier, and Grizzly Flats, while not in the top 15, came out, I believe that was in the top 20 of our communities as well, was quite impacted this year. So I definitely can look into why Clovis, why that came out, and sometimes there's some noise in the model, and that things kind of come out higher than they shouldn't have. I know a previous assessment we did in Washington, there was a community there that came out really high, and some of that was just a mismapping of land fire. And we didn't, with this data set, we were using land fire off the shelf, not any of the calibrated data that's more refined to the local landscape, which is definitely available for California for sure.
I know someone in the chat mentioned it could have to do something with accessibility, just that so many of those homes in that area are so outside of response time. So interesting thought, maybe, potentially.
Yeah.
On that, do you know if this housing risk assessment included any kind of year was built or codes, or I'm thinking of home hardening situations?
Yeah, and no, and that's definitely a limitation to this data. And I think, well, even some of the more refined ones, the wildfire risk or the contemporary wildfire hazard, which you can find on our website, those don't include that as well. And part of that is just to have data that's that fine scale, as well as that has the resolution that you're looking at, where if you had really fine resolution for one county, it doesn't really help you that much when you're looking at a state assessment or larger. That you could definitely skew the results only because of you have finer resolution data in one area versus another. So none of that sort of really site-specific information is in this. And again, this is not really the focus of this project, which is sort of an interesting part I wanted to look at. It was kind of trying to analyze these differences in the different field treatment strategies.
I know you're not the first person to run into issues with trying to get data on, home hardening like that finer resolution and even just the records. So I'm going to answer this or ask this one next, just because it's kind of a follow up with that, and then we'll get to probably the last one of the hour. But what about using the state mandated defensible space requirements for California as a primary delineation around homes?
Sure. Yeah, and I think they're definitely for more site-specific analysis. I think something like that could definitely make a lot of sense. If there's some regulation of yeah, where there's resources that could be allocated based on distance and that sort of thing, I think you could definitely overlay that on this. I mean, part of this was we had these two different study areas within New Mexico and California. And California, I think, is unique in that there's a lot more high quality data that's available versus other places in the country. And we wanted to sort of have an apples and apples comparison between the two. And again, while a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, I think we're quite interested in sort of teasing out some of the differences that we were seeing between the two different landscapes, where in New Mexico, you sort of have these sort of pockets of federal ownership with very dispersed populations around them, and that differences in of where homes are located and the density of homes and that sort of thing in relation to federal lands was different. And we saw very different patterns where in New Mexico, treating immediately around homes was the go-to scenario for all treatments, and that really gave you the best bang for the buck. Where we're seeing in California was a little bit different, with that on treating on federal lands gave you the greatest opportunity for wildfire use. And the difference of why that is, we're still trying to understand a little bit.
Interesting. We're going to switch gears a little bit here. It sounds like a little bit more about how the fire spread simulations actually work. So do ignitions from the same location typically result in approximately the same fire perimeters when you're running through these simulations?
Yeah, so jump back to one of them. So I guess it didn't mention this, but with each of where we simulated put down a fire, so it uses the FlamMap MTT algorithm for how that fire is simulated across the landscape. And each ignition, the ignition point is held constant through all the different scenarios. So the fire that starts here starts exactly there in every treatment scenario and gets fed in the exact same weather variables. So if you were to keep the fuelscape constant, you'd have the exact same fire perimeter every time. It would look identical to each other. And so what we're seeing is as we're changing the fuelscape underneath, you have a different rate of spread, you have different flame lengths that's associated with that. The trimming algorithm that allows for fire suppression is going to behave differently. So you get different perimeters, but only if you change the fuelscape underneath. If you kept the fuelscape the same, you get the exact same perimeter every time. That part, the actual growth part, is stochastic.
Great. And I think this one actually is going to be our last. You're sure.
Yeah.
Do you have plans to peer review this and publish this kind of research?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're working with Matt right now, Thompson, and we've got two publications that are sort of in the works that we're trying to figure out what's the best place to put them, and then trying to wrap up sort of this, what are the conclusions and that sort of thing. So I'd say within the next year, hopefully we'll have this in publication.
Excellent. Well, feel free to let us know too, and we can spread it to probably some of the same folks who registered for today. So with that, it looks like we have, I don't think I'm missing any other questions. Oh, actually there is one in the chat. Let's see. Can you mention a bit more about the fuel treatment details? So what parameters or measures are used? Trees per acre, canopy cover, basal area?
Yeah. So it's very variable. So it is specific to each expected vegetation type, and then based on canopy cover and trees per acre. There's the way that the fuels treatment that's implemented is going to vary based on that. And it's using, so for this project, more or less, I mean, there's a custom set of rules, but we're in sort of tofu delta is the land fire tool, if folks are familiar with that. And so we're using an FDIS code there of FDIS 5 years later treatment, and that's being implemented as a mechanical remove. So what the specific, what that looks like, it's going to go back to how these treatments were implemented in sort of land fires sort of world. So they're going to be similar to any treatment that if land fire picks up a treatment from the facts database and then implements it in the next iteration of what their treatments look like, this treatment's going to match that. But they're going to be highly variable across the landscape. And if you're interested in, so I guess, getting more in sort of the weeds on that, we can talk about that offline.
Great. I'll make one last plug to fill out that survey. I'll send that out in the follow-up email with the recording of this presentation whenever it comes available. And I know we can't officially clap, but thank you so much, Kevin. That was great, and I learned a lot. So take.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Take care.
Bye.